Welcome back to Bot Thoughts by AmtocSoft. I'm Alex. Today's episode starts with a security failure that looks boring until it absolutely is not. Imagine an MCP tool server that still verifies cryptographically. The artifact digest matches. The provenance bundle is there. The registry receipt is intact. Every supply chain check says green, but the agent now calls that same tool with a broader authorization scope than the original review ever approved. Sam, that is the kind of failure where the dashboard says safe, and the incident reviewer says, wait, what authority did we just hand this thing?
Exactly. That is the distinction between artifact integrity and trust composition. Artifact integrity asks whether this package, binary, or server still matches the evidence you retained. Trust composition asks whether the verified thing is still being used under the same assumptions. With MCP, those assumptions include tool contracts, resource classes, transport, authorization scope, delegation mode, and the current application rule that invokes the server. A verified tool can still need readmission because the authority envelope around it changed.
Let's anchor this for listeners. We just published blog 255 on authorization-bound replay and token scope drift. This podcast is the conversation version. If somebody has not been following the whole MCP supply chain series, what is the one-sentence problem?
The one-sentence problem is this. Replaying an MCP server trust decision is incomplete if you only recheck the artifact and ignore the authorization scope used by the current agent workflow. The original admission might have covered read-only documentation search. 6 weeks later, the same tool might be routed into a customer record update workflow. If replay only says the server still verifies, it misses the more important fact. The old decision never approved that new authority.
Why is this becoming urgent now? MCP has been around long enough for people to build tool registries, but this sounds like a second-order problem. Not just can the model call tools, but can we explain what authority those tools had when the decision was made?
That is exactly why it matters now. Early MCP adoption was about capability. Can the agent read files, query Postgres, open GitHub issues, pull from Notion, or call an internal service? The next phase is governance. The official MCP authorization spec describes authorization for HTTP-based transports, where clients can request restricted servers on behalf of resource owners. Once that is in play, every replay decision has to understand not only what server was called, but on whose behalf with which scope, and under which application contract.
So artifact-only replay is not wrong. It is just narrow. What does it catch and what does it miss?
Artifact-only replay catches a lot of important things. It can detect whether an artifact digest changed, whether a signature still verifies, whether a provenance statement is missing, whether the registry evidence disappeared, or whether current policy rejects an old signing pattern. That is all real security work. It misses the authority join. It cannot tell you that the tool moved from a read-only resource class to a write-capable one. It cannot tell you that the delegation mode changed from interactive user action to long-lived automation. It cannot tell you that the application contract now touches sensitive data.
Give me the concrete example. I want the version a platform engineer would see in a ticket.
Sure, original admission. An MCP server called DocSearch is approved for read-only access to engineering documentation. The archive stores the server receipt, signer identity, provenance reference, tool schema digest, and an authorization assumption that maps to docs read. 2 months later, a support automation workflow reuses that server, but now the token envelope includes ticket read and customer metadata read. The artifact still verifies. The registry receipt is fine. But the resource class changed. Replay should emit readmit with reason codes like artifact receipt verified, resource class changed, and application contract touches customer data.
Here is my pushback. If the current token is valid and the runtime authorization policy allows it, why does the replay system need to care about the old assumption? Isn't current authorization the source of truth?
Current authorization is the source of truth for whether the call is allowed right now. It is not the source of truth for whether the supply chain admission decision covered that use. Those are different questions. A valid token means the identity and policy system says this caller may request this authority. It does not prove the tool was reviewed for that authority. If a tool was admitted for read-only documentation and is later used for customer rights, current auth can be valid while the old trust composition is stale.
Let's list the records. What has to exist in the archive for this to work without retaining secrets?
You do not store bearer tokens. That would be a bad idea. You store normalized authority projections. At minimum, I want scope class, resource class, delegation mode, audience class, expiry class, and the policy digest that produce the mapping. Pair that with the artifact receipt digest, tool contract digest, and current application impact class. Then Replay can compare old assumption to current token envelope without ever opening a raw token value.
Normalized authority projections sounds like one of those phrases that hides a lot of pain. What makes it hard?
The pain is provider vocabulary. One provider might call something docs.read. Another says knowledge base view. An internal gateway says reference:"read." Those might all map to resource read. The mapping has to be owned by policy, versioned, and recorded by digest. Otherwise, you cannot tell whether a replay result changed because the token changed, because the resource changed, or because the mapping table changed. The mapping is part of the evidence.
Walk through the drift types. Same, narrowed, lateral, widened, and unattributed. What do those mean operationally?
Same is easy. The old and current scope classes line up. Narrowed means the current authority is a subset of the old one, like moving from read-write to read-only. Lateral means the permission rank is similar but the resource class changed, like docs read to ticket read. Widen means the current authority is broader, like read-only to privileged write. Unattributed means the archive cannot prove what the old assumption was. For privileged contracts, unattributed should usually quarantine, because missing context is not neutral.
The blog mentions a gotcha, renamed or refined scopes that look like drift. Tell that story, because it feels like the kind of bug that creates noisy security programs.
This one bit me in a fixture. An old scope called resource read split into case read and docs read. The current token showed case read, the archived assumption showed resource read, and the first replay implementation called that lateral drift. That was noisy because the new class was actually narrower, not sideways. The fix was a subset proof. If the policy mapping can prove the new class is contained by the old authority, replay emits scope class refined, not readmit. If there is no subset proof, then yes, readmit.
How does this relate to Sigstore, SLSA, and OpenTelemetry? I do not want listeners thinking we are replacing those layers with yet another homegrown security record.
Good distinction. Sigstore is useful for signing and verification. SLSA gives a supply chain framework and provenance vocabulary. OpenTelemetry's generative AI semantic conventions help the runtime layer carry consistent attributes. MCP defines the tool and authorization boundary. Authorization-bound replay does not replace any of them. It composes their outputs into an application decision. Given this verified artifact, this old authority assumption, this current token envelope, and this current contract impact, what should the platform do now?
Let's talk about the disposition vocabulary. Continue, readmit, quarantine, retire. Why those four?
Continue means the current use still composes with the retained evidence and authority assumption. Readmit means the evidence is not necessarily bad, but the current use is outside the old decision and needs a fresh admission. Quarantine means the platform cannot support the review question safely, often because evidence or archived scope is missing for a privileged contract. Retire means current policy says this tool or authority composition should no longer be used. The labels are useful, but the reason codes are more important.
Reason codes are a theme in this whole content cluster. Give me the reason code set you would want on day one.
Day 1, I would want artifact receipt verified, artifact receipt unavailable, scope class unchanged, scope class narrowed, scope class widened, resource class changed, delegation mode changed, archived scope assumption missing, privileged contract requires readmission, subset proof present, and scope class refined. That set is enough to separate 4 repair queues: supply chain evidence problems, authorization mapping problems, product workflows gaining authority, and archive retention gaps.
What should teams test? Not philosophically, but actual fixtures.
Test the joins. Verified artifact, same read scope, low impact contract should continue. Verified artifact, widened scope, low impact contract should readmit. Verified artifact, widened scope, privileged contract should readmit with a privileged reason. Missing archived scope with a privileged contract should quarantine. Failed artifact evidence with a privileged contract should quarantine. Scope refinement with a subset proof should continue. The bug surface is not one validator. It is the interaction between evidence, authority, and impact.
Let's pause on metrics, because this is where a lot of security systems lose the plot. What should a team actually graph? If the only chart is total blocked tools, everyone will argue about whether security is being too strict. What are the counters that help a platform team repair the system?
I would graph scope widening readmits, missing archive scope quarantines, lateral resource class drift, privileged contract scope drift, and override count by rule owner. Then slice all of them by tool family and application contract. The point is not to produce a scary number. The point is to find the repair queue. Missing archived scope means the admission writer did not retain enough. Lateral drift concentrated in one product workflow means the workflow changed data classes. Overrides concentrated under one owner means the rubric may be too blunt, or that team is bypassing the process.
Paint the incident version. It is Monday morning. A customer support agent workflow gets quarantined. People are annoyed. What should the replay results show so this does not become a 2-hour meeting where nobody knows what failed?
The result should be short enough to paste into the ticket. Something like, receipt digest verified, old scope docs read, current scope customer record write, current contract privileged, disposition readmit, reason privileged contract requires fresh admission. That is actionable. The support team knows the tool artifact was not the problem. The platform team knows authorization changed. The security team knows this is not a random block. The next action is fresh admission for that specific authority composition, not a generic investigation into every MCP server.
You mentioned expiry class earlier, and I think that one is easy to overlook. Why does replay need to know whether the old authority was interactive, service rotated, or long-lived?
Because the same scope with a different lifetime can be different authority in practice. A 5-minute interactive delegation is not the same as a long-lived automation credential, even if both map to the same semantic scope class. If the old admission assumed interactive short-lived user action and the current workflow uses a service credential that runs every hour, the operational risk changed. Replay should emit delegation mode changed or expiry class changed. Again, you do not store the bearer token. You store the normalized authority shape.
There is also a human factor here. Developers tend to see readmission as bureaucracy. How do you explain this without making it sound like security theater?
I would frame readmission as preserving the original bargain. The tool was approved for one use under one authority envelope. If the product wants to use it with broader authority, that may be perfectly reasonable. Readmission is the moment where the platform says, yes, that new use is covered too. It is not punishment. It is how you keep a verified tool from becoming an unreviewed privileged integration by accident. The tone matters. If teams can see the exact reason code and the exact path to approval, they are much less likely to treat the system as arbitrary.
Who should own the mapping table? Security? Platform? The team that owns the identity provider? I can imagine this getting political very quickly.
It should be policy-owned with platform implementation. Security should define the risk classes and review rules. The identity or authorization team should help map provider-specific scopes. The platform team should implement the replay worker and archive writer. Product teams should own application contract impact for their workflows. If one group owns all of it, the mapping will be blind in at least one direction. The important engineering detail is that the mapping table has a digest and release process, just like code.
How would you roll this out? without creating a pile of false positives and angry product teams.
Start report only for low-impact reads. Enforce readmission for privileged contracts first. Quarantine only when the reason code is clear, like failed evidence or missing archived scope for privileged use. Build dashboards around reason code distribution, not just red counts. If the top reason is archived scope missing, fix the archive writer. If the top reason is scope widened, talk to the workflow owner. If the top reason is mapping changed, review the policy table. That keeps the security program from turning into a vague blocker.
What is the most common mistake you expect teams to make when they first implement this?
They will treat scope strings as the truth. Raw strings are unstable. A provider renames a scope. An internal gateway splits one permission into 3. A tenant-specific audience value changes. If replay compares raw strings, it will either miss real drift or flood the team with false drift. The truth surface is the normalized projection plus the mapping policy digest. That feels like extra work until the first quarterly review asks why 2 identical-looking tokens produce different decisions.
What should listeners do next if they have an MCP registry already growing inside the company?
First, inventory which MCP servers are reachable from production agent workflows. Second, classify the application contracts. Read-only, standard write, privileged write, sensitive data, expensive external action. Third, add normalized authorization assumptions to new admissions. Fourth, run report-only replay against the current set. Fifth, pick one privileged workflow and enforce readmission when scope drift appears. Do not start by trying to solve every server and every policy. Start where the blast radius justifies the rigor.
One more layer before takeaways. Where does observability fit? If I already have traces showing which agent called which tool, do I still need this replay record?
Yes, because traces and replay answer different questions. A trace can tell you that an agent invoked a tool, how long it took, what span attributes were present, and maybe which user or workflow triggered it. That is runtime evidence. The replay record asks whether the tool's archived admission, authorization assumption, and current contract still compose. OpenTelemetry attributes can link to receipt digests and contract identifiers, which is extremely useful. But a trace should not become the authority record. It should point to the authority record.
What about cost? This sounds like a lot of joins and policy checks. Does every single agent tool call need a full replay?
No, and that is a critical design point. Replay is not necessarily inline with every tool call. You can run it on policy changes, contract impact changes, registry updates, evidence retention changes, and scheduled review windows. For privileged tools, you may also require a fresh review before enabling a new authority composition. The trick is to cache stable review results by receipt digest, scope mapping digest, token envelope class, and contract digest. Then the runtime can check a compact disposition, instead of doing expensive verification work on every call.
So the boundary is: runtime enforcement checks the current decision, replay produces or refreshes that decision, and the archive preserves why the decision was defensible.
Exactly. Keep those roles separate and the system stays explainable. Collapse them and you get one giant authorization blob that nobody trusts. Runtime needs a fast answer. Replay needs a defensible answer. Archive needs an immutable answer about what was known when the old decision was made. Authorization-bound replay is the join between those answers, not a replacement for any one of them.
Let me try to summarize. 1. Verified artifacts are necessary but not sufficient. 2. MCP replay needs old authorization assumptions and current token envelopes. 3. Scope drift has direction, same, narrowed, lateral, widened, or unattributed. 4. Reason codes are the repair surface. And 5. Enforcement should start where the blast radius is highest, privileged contracts. Did I miss the most important thing?
Only the mindset. Replay is not there to make old decisions look good. It is there to preserve the difference between what the platform knew then and what the platform knows now. If the artifact still verifies but the current authority envelope is different, that is not a contradiction. Both facts can be true. A mature agent platform keeps both facts visible and makes a fresh decision when the composition changes.
that is the show. This was Bot Thoughts by AmtocSoft, episode P040. The companion blog is MCP Server Supply Chain Integrity, Authorization-Bound Replay and Token Scope Drift Composition, live on amtocsoft.blogspot.com. If this was useful, subscribe on YouTube or Spotify, and if you want to support the work, you can buy us a coffee at buymeacoffee.com/AmtocSoft. Next time, we will keep following the agent security trail into evidence receipts, replay policy, and the parts of tool use that only look boring until production gets involved.